Okay, so I appreciate everyone's patience and, well, just everyone. As I was sitting here, I realized that the presentation I brought is probably not the presentation I should give, because this is, I was thinking, oh, I'm going to be presenting a bunch of people. They're going to want to learn about personal publishing and the tools available in the open source industry. And while watching the previous presentation, I realized you guys write them. And so when it comes to depth of knowledge, and most of the people in here probably know more than I do. But let me share a little bit of where I'm coming from. And this might not work so well. I thought it was going to. And explain kind of my background and why this is of interest to me. So by training, I'm a scientist. I primarily use the tools you create. And I've stuck with open source for, well, not stuck with, but I've started using open source really quite a bit in the last 5 or 6 years. And the reason I use it is all of the reasons that we normally talk about. The ability to control our own data, the ability to take the intellectual commons property that exists and develop very wonderful user experiences on top of them, as well as just the ability to work with the community and the individuals and the experts that are there and who are often building tools that they themselves are going to use. But as I've started to use this in my own work, as well as some of the side projects I collaborate on, something else kind of came to the forefront. And that was the tools that you guys have created are not just that they're not just useful and valuable and free, they're also in many cases the best tools available. And in terms of things that I've recently started to get involved with, it makes a lot of sense for publishers and writers and individuals who have ideas to use those tools in order to reach the enormous audience that the internet makes possible. So to get started off, I want to talk about a big picture thing, or at least something that I found very, very inspiring. And that was the recent revolution in Egypt. And I followed closely and read quite a bit about how that came together and the different parties that were involved. And something emerges when you look at report after report after report. It's that rather than having a big political organization or a large group of established dissidents, these people were almost like hobbyist revolutionaries. There was a couple of websites, and there were a couple of very, very motivated people and activists and bloggers, but for the most part, the millions of people who showed up there, they weren't members of the Muslim Brotherhood, they weren't members of anything. What ended up happening is somebody with a message, through the power of the internet, connected with somebody where that message resonated, and within 2 weeks, starting on January 25th, and finalized by February 18th, we'd seen the overthrow of a dictator. Now, I know that in terms of the basic story, we don't know what's going to happen yet. We don't know if this revolution is going to be successful, if we're going to see a new era of freedom in the Middle East. But what we have seen is that if somebody takes an idea and that idea resonates with someone else, then amazing things can happen. And I guess that's kind of what the open source movement in a nutshell is all about. The ability to take something useful and apply it to either make money, to change the world, or what have you. And this matters a lot to publishers or to writers or to anyone who has some crazy idea, whether it be a novel, or in my case, I'm just starting to get involved with a lot of humanitarian aid groups. And they have ideas about how they can alleviate poverty and accomplish big things, but they need to find an audience for their ideas. They need to present that information, either in written form or video or what have you, in a way that will resonate with other people. And it seems like the market is now changing to make that possible. This morning, during the first talk, we heard a lot about how Amazon and Barnes & Noble and Apple and Google are now creating these publishing platforms where someone like me, without making a huge investment in marketing or infrastructure, I can reach millions of people at one time. And that's incredible. But not only is the market shifting, but the way people are behaving are shifting. The new tablets and other things are changing how people buy books. I've thrown together two long-tailed curves, and unfortunately they're not to scale, but the idea is this. Up until the early 2000s, our economy was dominated by hit-driven hits, or by large, big budget hits that then gross a huge amount of money. And then while there might have been niche interests shown in gray here, and the reds and the hits are shown in red, most of the money was concentrated in those hits. In the last 10 years, though, with Amazon, and mostly with Amazon, we've seen the dynamics change. Now, people are spending about the same amount of money on the hits, but they're also spending a lot more money on niche content. The Kindle is probably the most interesting case study here. When someone buys a Kindle, they also start buying a lot more books. It's more convenient. You see a book that you want to read and you say, oh, I want to read The Dream of the Perpetual Motion. And instead of going to Amazon to buy a physical hard copy and waiting for 3 weeks while they ship it to you, you purchase it and you download it and it's there. And you may never read that book. But the ability to tap into the marketplace and purchase it is so simple that you spend more money on books. A couple of weeks ago, because I've been playing around with this, I bought a Barnes & Noble Nook. And it's a wonderful device. It runs Linux. And I've been very, very impressed with it. I'm looking forward to them opening their Android store next month. But I've watched my spending on books go through the roof for that exact same reason. And so, as someone who wants to get into publishing, who wants to get into writing, this is tremendously powerful. But being a small business, oh no, that didn't work. Well, let's see how this. Being somebody who is a small business owner, and even though I don't have to make a huge investment in marketing and the platform, I do have to make my content compelling. And that is very, very difficult. Publishing companies spend a lot of money in order to get their message out there. And they've created very sophisticated tools. The Adobe Creative Suite, for example, it makes it possible for writers to collaborate with designers, to collaborate with editors, to produce something that people want to pick up and read. Like I was just talking about The Dream of Perpetual Motion. This is a book that I heard about from a friend, and then I was browsing through the Barnes & Noble store, and I liked the cover, so I downloaded the book. I still haven't read it yet. But that integration of design and well-chosen words and grabbing people's attention is really, really important. And I think that's also true for software. And so over the last about year and a half, I've been trying to understand what open source tools exist that allow me to mesh those three workflows. I've got an author who writes, perhaps using KOffice. I've got a publisher who needs to create an EPUB if it's going to Amazon, or a PDF if it's going to be printed. And I have the designer who needs to be able to create a very attractive looking both illustration for the cover as well as interior using the best technologies available. And that's how this really absurdly ugly looking diagram was born, which shows the relationship between what an author might do, research, ideas, notes, images, graphs, outline, to what an editor might do, creating a draft, editing that draft, revising it, creating a template, which then will be used to generate a layout and a PDF. And in this particular drawing, I don't have it, but in a different one I do. At the same time, you want to generate an electronic version of the text that can go to publication. As that really scary-looking diagram shows, there's a lot of steps. But even though there's a lot of steps, open source has created tools to make it happen. There's Zotero, Mendeley, and BibTeX, which allow you to organize references, to exchange PDFs and other documents with collaborators. When you're ready to begin combining all of your ideas and putting them together into a semblance of manuscript, you can use visual diagramming tools like Vue, Xmind, and Freeplane. And when you're ready to start writing, you can make use of tools like KOffice. But the ones I'm going to choose to focus on are Wix, LitTeX, DocBook. And because they're all text-based, we can collaborate using version control. Now, I do some coding, but my coding skills are laughable at best and downright humiliating at worst. And so I've just recently discovered version control. And something that you, as developers, have been taking advantage and loving for, what, how old is UCS? 15 years old, 20 years old?
Older than that.
Around there.
40,
I found Subversion, and while Subversion may be terrible for a code collaboration, it's actually a very good tool for writers. Who would have thought? Because the centralized workspace gives the editor the ability to go, I want you working on this one, you working on this file, you working on this file. They can have the blocks placed, and then when the centralized changes come in, you can review them and adjust. It works better than a distributed version control system, at least for that kind of collaboration. And then finally, when you're ready to start doing layout, you've got tools such as Scribus. And so this open source ecosystem, as I've started to play with it, and I've started to work with 2 nonprofits who are putting out reports based on their actions in South America and Africa, we found that this streamlines everything. Instead of having to hire a designer, they're able to do much of the work in-house, and it saves them a lot of money and time and effort, which then can be plugged into creating better reports and better disseminating the message. So based on who I'm talking to, I was going to talk about and show you Zotero and Mendeley and how you can hook it up so that you can download a citation from the internet and it'll grab, say, a picture from Flickr or the full text of a PDF. You can then synchronize that to a central server, but you already all know that. And so I'd like to, if I can, spend a little bit of time as someone who's not necessarily a coder, talking about what a potential publisher is looking for in KOffice, as well as Wix, or another program that is being used for writing. And I hope you'll indulge me while I do that. I know that it's much better than sending a very long email saying, I've got all these great ideas, most of which you've probably heard and have just chosen to overlook for technical reasons or what have you. So the first thing I want to talk about is, from an editorial standpoint, I've already mentioned that it's very important that documents have good design. It's like a beautifully designed computer desktop or a beautifully designed program. When you first interact with a document, you need to be able to find information. You need to be able to work your way through and locate what you want to know, or just revel in the sheer beauty. And for thousands and thousands of years, the document design has typically been done by the person creating the document. And if they were good, that person would give a ton of thought to it. For example, this image shown here at right is taken from Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks. And if you translate the text that's just to the right that I've cropped out of the image, this is what you say, this is what you see. Or line AM intersect CV, there you will find the meeting place of the senses. And that's referring to a spot where a bunch of the cranial nerves cross. And that's the little bit of text. And then underneath that, Leonardo's written, remember when you represent the head from the inside to make another, which shall show the outside turned in the same direction as this, so that you may better appreciate the whole. What he's basically doing is he's designing his document. This note, if you go back into the history and look, he intended to compile all of his anatomical sketches into a big book and share that with the world as the fundamental, the definitive description of anatomy at that time. And so he's thinking like an artist in that he wants the people to really get the message that he wants them to get, rather than misunderstand. And so this separation and careful thought about what we're saying, in addition to how we're saying it, is something that I would love to see more of in the open source tools. Already, we do a pretty good job. For example, if we're talking about LIX, LIX does a very nice job of separating content and presentation. They've got insets that can then be used to typeset a DocBook XML file, or an XHTML file, or a PDF through LaTeX. But even there, many of the markups and the conventions are still based on old, instead of something that an author might make more sense of. For example, an emphasis tag, which we might see in HTML. And LaTeX does have an emphasis tag, but LIX just doesn't use it very well. And then on the opposite side of that very same spectrum, we have tools that we need to be very finicky about how we present information, about illustrations, how we create a poster, for example. And that's where tools such as Scribus come in. But Scribus doesn't have a good way for me to go back to a K-Office document, import the text from that K-Office document, and apply my styles to it. And so if we could move away from what we currently have, which is an emphasis on presentation and tags that create presentation, towards a more semantic markup. That would be the first thing that I would love to see. And it might also allow us to better handle import and export from Word. One of the great frustrations with programs like, I'm going to pick on Apple Pages, but one of the great frustrations with Apple Pages or a similar program is that it's emphasized on creating a beautiful print document. But for a publisher, print is only one of the platforms that I want to target. I also want to export to a web page, and I want to export to an ebook. And each one of those platforms has a completely different set of design constraints. When I'm reading something on a 7-inch screen, I have to reflow that text in one way, whereas if I'm reading it on a 14-inch screen or monitor in a web browser versus a print document. And while while Apple Pages, for example, does a very good job of creating a print document, it doesn't allow me, if I export this as an XHTML document or as an EPUB, it maintains the same formatting. It doesn't scale to the device. And so if there was a semantic way of moving the text into the other programs that I need in my workflow, that would allow me to move the same text, for example, from LIX into Sigil and create a EPUB, or move it from LIX into Scribus and create a very fussy, for lack of a better term, layout. And so, yeah. And so, what I would really like to see, and I'm going to show you what works and what doesn't, is the ability for different people to contribute the components that they do very well. For example, in KOffice, it has a similar problem that it has to Wix or to Apple Pages. It's designed for creating the page that I'm looking at. I can't, for example, in KOffice, easily export that to XHTML, or someone throws something at me if I can, but then bring in a designer and say, okay, for my website, I want this to use these styles. I want it to use this CSS. Is that possible? Can I take random XHTML from KOffice and apply a CSS style sheet that I've hired a designer to create, and then export all of that information into either an HTML file or into an EPUB that I could then disseminate on Amazon? No, silence is not good. But that is something, as someone who wants to use the software, that would be incredibly useful to me. I don't care where the CSS comes from. I don't care if that designer codes that by hand. I don't care if that was created by a machine. All I want is CSS that I can feed to my words and create something beautiful that I can then feed to my audience and hopefully either communicate my point or make lots of money. And so this very point of conversation came up on the Wix mailing list about a year ago. And the developers got together and said, this is something that we need to do. This is something that's important. And they've started laying the foundations for that to happen. And so within Wix, we can finally, using LaTeX target print and using an XHTML converter, target both EPUB and web. And we can take advantage of a sort of that workflow that I just described to you. I can take my CSS sheet and I can apply it to the styles in my Wix document and get one publication for one medium and another publication for another. But at the same time, apparently my computer's not happy. At the same time, there are other constraints that I've got as well. And one of those is that I've got my images I have to take care of. If I'm targeting a print, then my images have to be much higher resolution than if I want to target the web. I mean, what are most screens? About 120 DPI and always getting better. But at print, you need 300 DPI at least. And many of the new presses that are coming out support resolutions up to 3,000 DPI. And so not only do I need to think about how my text and styles transfer, I also need to think about how my images transfer. And can I use the same image as a placeholder in the document and then have the software go, okay, now I'm exporting to a web environment. I need to scale that down to 76 DPI or 120 DPI. Now I'm doing a print environment. I need to scale that to 120 DPI. And to bring up Wix again, they've started to do that using ImageMagick and the other open image toolkits. They've got code together that, depending on where you're exporting to, it will then generate the image that you need. The other thing that's very, very important, and I'm not sure how KOffice does here, but it's how well do we follow conventions? How well do we, are we like Microsoft Word? Or are we like LaTeX, where we get little things like ligatures right? In Word, it doesn't support the open type features that allow you to get a nice transition between the F and I, for example, or the joined swashes in the F and L. And that's important. If I don't get that right, and I give that to a discerning reader or to a designer, they're going to notice it off the bat. And when you're talking with a group of authors, they say, well, get the typography right. It's always the first question out of their mouth. And again, Wix does a great job here because it makes use of LaTeX. And LaTeX has got 25 years worth of research behind it to help do that. How does K-Office do? Or is there a way that K-Office, when you're creating a very high quality publication, might be able to make use of those other underlying technologies in a fairly opaque way to the user, so that they don't have to deal with the headaches of LIX, where all of a sudden when you're trying to print your document and goes, oh my God, I can't compile. And so, and similar things with small caps and kerning. And as I said, finally, you get down to, there are certain types of publications where layout matters a lot. And let me show you a different document that gets this point across. A couple of months ago, I helped do a redesign of the KDE EV newsletter. And it was a fun project. It was my real first exposure to KDE and the awesome community that you guys have. But this particular type of newsletter probably wouldn't have worked out very well as a reflowable document. There was too many images, there were too much structure, and so it needed to be prepared for print, which meant a PDF, even though it was being sent out over the internet. And so the question that I have is, for like K-Office and related this is not the final version, but it's enough to get the point across. Could I print this to a PDF and then incorporate this layout with all of the embedded fonts right into my document? Because that's something that's very, very important for a professional publisher. If I've got, for example, an illustration or a PDF that someone's created for me in Inkscape or Adobe Illustrator or even InDesign, I need to be able to put that into my work. I've spent probably $1,000 to hire that illustrator to create that technical drawing. And if I can't use the vector illustration, then I'm out my $1,000. It's not going to scale with printers. And exporting that to 3000 DPI and sending a 1 GB sized ping image isn't going to work. And so I guess as a last point, can I go all control freakish and take that information and put that right into the document that I intend to send to print? And even better, will it create a scaled version of the image that is a raster image? And can I put that into my electronic document that I need to send? And so for a lot of those questions, the answer, at least for LIX, is yes. It does a lot of that. And I put together a very simple document that was supposed to be this presentation, except delivered without halts and without problems, and this will be enough to get the point across. So using LIX, I can do that. This open source manifesto cover that it can't find and is complaining about is was the same illustration in the other talk or in the other slides that I created with all of the diagrams and the arrows. And it's able, because it's working with LaTeX, and LaTeX has got very, very good support of PDFs, to pull that in and embed the vector image rather than a raster. But if I'm exporting to web, it will take the it will create a raster for me that then becomes the cover for my ebook. This is, and also LaTeX is able to do some really cool things. For example, this is, it's typeset for print. It's created a very nice print document with full justification, and it's even got a couple of really fancy features enabled. For example, I'm not sure if you can see it here as well, but it's got optical alignment of characters. And that's where the machine goes through, and if there's a quotation, then the quotation mark hangs slightly into the margin. And if there's a dash, then the dash also hangs slightly into the margin. But otherwise, the characters line up straight. And that slight degree of offset makes it look like there's a cleaner margin for you. I'm able to do fancy things like typeset epigraphs here. I'm able to have automatic numbering of figures. I'm able to do things like put the name of the chapter on each page or the name of the section. Things that Word doesn't handle very well. And yet, if I want to then target a web platform, I can export it to XHTML. And this is what it looks like when I export it to a web page. I've got much of the information is the same, but it's formatted for the web. And I can do things like highlight over, and instead of having my footnote at the bottom of the page, I've got it embedded within the document. And if I were to create a ebook of this, and put it on my Nook, I could press on that link and it would take me right to that footnote. And then there'll be a link that will take me back. I can scale my images, but I've still got all of my figure numbering, but more importantly, it allows me to incorporate my references and my research. And so I'm keeping my documentation trail. And all of that happens automatically. And it ties into the many, many wonderful existing open source tools. And I'm in danger of running over. But this is a start. And I guess one of the reasons I wanted to come to this conference was to try and meet the developers and talk about ways that we and I, as part of the LaTeX designer community, can work with you in order to create tools that would benefit us both. For example, as much as I love LaTeX, and I think it's a great program, I think it's unrealistic for me to expect everyone in the world to adopt it. But we share in common with the K-Office project that we would love to have a very good set of import filters that we could then use to extract the semantic information from that Microsoft Word document and say, okay, this is a header, this is a subsection header, this is a figure legend, and translate that into something that I can then put into LaTeX or I can put into a similar program and typeset. And then I can go out to my designer and say, okay, I've got the words from the author, they're in the program that's coordinating everything. Design me my style sheet so that it's beautiful, and then I can export and use it and really reach my audience and get my message across. And with that, I guess I will conclude with 3 basic take-home points. There is an open source publishing toolkit, and it is very, very good. But it's good for someone who is a professional and who is willing to spend the time required in order to learn it. If you want to customize a LaTeX document, you have to know LaTeX. If you want to customize a web page that you export from LaTeX, and let me just say, the HTML that comes out of LaTeX is very, very clean. There's a style sheet, there's an ID tag or a div, and there's the style sheet. That's it. There's no crap that like what currently comes out of Microsoft Word. But that's not enough for someone just some random stranger who has an idea that might change the world. One of the groups that I happen to work with is Choice. It's called Choice. They're a small, very bootstrap organization, but they've got a lot of ideas that have been proven to change and alleviate poverty, and they're trying now to compile academic articles that demonstrate that, and write reports, as I was saying when I started. But if you put one of their reports, typeset in Word, next to a professionally designed report put out by Charity Water, their ideas are not going to penetrate. They're not going to reach the intended target. And they don't have the money necessary to hire a professional designer or to invest in the Adobe toolkit, which would allow them to do that. They need to go with open source. And so I hope that as that laundry list of items will hopefully fall on the right ears. And I would love to talk with anyone from the respective projects about potential collaboration opportunities. And with that, I'll stop. Are there any questions? Yeah.
I'm interested in knowing what your thoughts are on how we can make these tools more approachable for the average folk. It's obvious from your presentation that these tools are powerful, they have great value for expert users, and I guess part of what you're saying is you're evangelizing these tools to people who might not use them, or might not know about them, or might think they're too hard to learn and don't see benefits. So how can we, as developers or as a community, improve adoption, make it more rewarding for people to actually use these powerful tools?
I'm glad that you asked that question. And I think that I don't have a bullet point answer, and so this is going to be a little bit rambling, but here's my thinking on it. I'm obviously presenting on this on a Mac, and I use Linux at work and at home. My desktops are all Linux, and I brought the Mac mostly so that I could show you Apple Pages. But one thing that Linux does really, really well, every tool has got a function, right? It's the Unix underpinning and design philosophy. What I think would be good is if, as we're building, for example, on KOffice, would it be possible to make a writer, for example, geared towards a writer? This is a plugin that I generated to use with Lex. And if you talk to writers, the de facto program that they all want is this thing called Scrivener. It runs only on the Mac platform. I guess there is a port of it to Windows that just came out a little while ago, but it's still in beta. And the reason they want it is it takes away the idea that, oh, I'm working on a printed page. And instead, you just have your writing, and it's split logically. And more importantly, the writer is able to split it in a way that makes sense to him or her. Does that make sense? And so underneath it all, you still have files, and they're organized into rich text and what have you. But the way the information is presented on screen is geared towards writing. They can use, for example, a corkboard metaphor. And maybe they're working on something, and they'll say, I want to have a chapter about evangelizing the platform. And I want that particular chapter to be everything that it takes to get people to use open source. They can go through, and if you notice up here, I should just be showing you Scrivener. If you notice up here, I've now got a section or a chapter titled Evangelizing the Platform. And my little note about what I was thinking is now encapsulated as part of a note. I'm able to store the information, or the metadata, I guess, about what am I writing about, separate from the words that might actually be used to describe it. And so what I'm getting at is this is more of a workflow that's tailored towards a writer. And so it's tools that allow me to do that. So when I'm writing and I'm using Lex to write, I'm writing. And then once I finish with that workflow, if I can then step into the next one, which is, okay, now I'm ready to design my page. and offer me a user experience for that. And at that point, maybe we should adopt standards. For the designing that page, can I import a CSS style sheet that may have been created by a designer? Or is there a tool out in the open source universe that allows me to create my own CSS style sheet without having to get into the nitty-gritty of the code? Does that make sense? So I think that's the first one. We tailor the experience to the individual who's using it. And if that means that we have multiple programs in the workflow, that's okay. One program doesn't have to do it all. I've got one program that might be tailored towards the designer, and not all designers can code. I might have another program that's tailored towards the writer. And I might have a third program where all of this comes together, and the production manager then creates all of the branching publications meant to go to ebooks or web or what have you. Does that answer the question or get at it?
Close enough approximation.
Okay.
Any other questions?
I have another question. Have you looked into these kind of low-tech markup formats for text? So like Markdown and stuff like that, where you really can just write your text and you don't have to know anything about XML and so on, but they're easy to process and to integrate.
Yes.
Have you looked into these kind of formats as part of such a process?
Absolutely, absolutely. And what I've found, at least with the authors that I've been trying to work with, is they don't want to deal with the markup. They don't want to deal with the markup language. In fact, they also don't even want to deal with styles. You'll sit down with them and you'll say, okay, Word has styles, OpenOffice has styles, KOffice has styles. If you click this little drop-down box, you'll see it's a paragraph, it's quotation, it's a, well, it's a subparagraph, it's a description, it's an itemized list, it's an epigraph. This is how they think. And yet they want to go, I want to place my text in the center of the page, I want it to be 18 points high, and I want it to be bold and purple. And so eventually, if you work with them enough, then they'll go, oh, okay, styles are really powerful. And then if I want to change my body text and make it pink, all I have to do is change the style instead of going to every paragraph and changing the formatting separately. And so there's that. And so they're resisting styles and trying to get them to adopt even a very simple document processing system like Markdown or Wiki. Wiki would be fantastic. It's easy to parse. There's tons and tons of engines out there that already do so. And so to adopt one of those and to make it the foundation of a new either desktop or web program would be really, really easy. But it seems like, at least with the nonprofits that I've been working with, they don't want to do that. And I've been not seeing them enough on use styles for everything. Just write with styles, and I'll write you a style sheet that'll be cool and awesome and beautiful. And they're finally starting to adopt that. And I don't know from a user standpoint how to change the psychology. I don't know how to get them thinking, write what you mean, not how you want it to look. And I would be interested in any ideas that people might have that I could then take back to Lex. Or even to the students that I occasionally work with at the University of Utah, who also do the same thing. It seems like that there's a difference in the psychology of people's thinking. There's serious documents, like a thesis or a book or a financial report. And then there's not so serious documents. And for not so serious documents, you use a word processor. And for serious documents, you use like LaTeX or Lex. And the only way that you're going to use LaTeX or Lex is if you're doing something serious and you have people who bully you into it. And so I think if we were to make it easier and to very clearly delineate the advantages that this sort of approach has, that there's a huge opportunity for a lot of people who have something to say that will then be able to say it in a both more clear and more beautiful fashion. And with that, thank you very much for your time.
All right, it's time for lunch. We have until 2:30, and then we'll take our group photo.
for